Okay, so I was asked to come here to talk about altmetrics and just how it relates to social media. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. Oh, I have a clicker. And I think many of you probably recall this or are pretty aware of it. Back in 2010, NASA did a press release to say we're going to have a press conference to announce a big discovery. And the day came, and it was pretty big. They said, by the way, we have discovered arsenic-based life. So pretty big deal. I mean, as far as we know, all life is based on phosphorus, and now they're saying, hey, there's something new. So that would be pretty cool, and it would have been very cool had it been true. Unfortunately for NASA, what seemed to have happened is that the researchers who were doing this work designed a fairly maybe poor experiment, executed it fairly poorly, and then when other researchers tried to replicate this, they found that it wasn't possible. Ultimately, the research was found to be invalid. So poor NASA. But the reason this story is kind of interesting for us today in the context of social media is kind of how this all transpired. So one of the first people to actually do a review of this work was Rosie Redfield. And to give a bit of background on her, she is a microbiologist professor at University of British Columbia, go Canada. And she does something a bit unique in that she has a blog where she just not only blogs about research, but she actually does what's kind of considered open research. So she blogs about her lab's research in real time and how it's working. So it's probably not surprising to you then that when she reported her results on this article, that she did it in her blog, and only in her blog. So, and she was not the only one. So after a couple days, since they made all this big stink about this fabulous finding, many researchers were also online saying, you know what, this seems a little funny, we have some issues, we're really questioning this research. And this is where things got maybe a little bit worse for NASA, and potentially they're a bit of a victim of the times, but their response was pretty much, this is not how scientific discourse occurs, and so we're not going to respond to this sort of fluffy blog stuff. If you want to hear from us, you submit your paper to a peer-reviewed journal, and we'll respond at that point. So Rosie and all the other sort of researchers were very diligent and took all their stuff from their blogs and submitted it to journals, and about 3 months later, it was all published there. Of course, that was kind of irrelevant, because anyone who was interested had read all this stuff online 3 months before. So this is a good example of sort of valid, impactful research that was done online, but because it wasn't done in the sort of mediums that we're used to, it kind of didn't count. And so this example and other sort of social media examples are showing that we have a really growing impact of social media, not only on society, but also on research. So to kind of avoid having the standard altmetrics sort of spiel, maybe do something a bit controversial. What if we considered sort of social media outputs to be primary research outputs? What would that be? So I'm not going to tackle that yet. First, I'm going to take you back to some basics. Talk a little bit what altmetrics are and what we can do with them. So from the publisher perspective, we often think of altmetrics as being about article level metrics. So things other than impact factor and citations that give you information about articles. But if we go back to sort of the broader description that took place in the Altmetric Manifesto, we see it's actually bigger than that. It's about two new things. So on one hand, we do have the alternative metrics, which you're all, I think, fairly aware of. But then we have the alternative products. So what that means is not just articles and not just books, but getting into things like code, data sets, and potentially blogs. So that's what they are. What do we want to do with them? So if you take a look at the different sort of stakeholders involved, authors, publishers, and funders, and you think about how do they use altmetrics, what do they want to do, it seems that they do things quite differently. I think you'll probably know from working with their authors that they want to see everything someone's saying about their work. They'll read all the Twitter sort of feeds, any blogs, any news articles, even from like the neighboring little town. Whereas publishers and funders tend to be a bit more discriminating. You guys are probably more interested in if your journals have had sort of international media coverage. So while the use cases seem quite different, actually, when you come down to it, it's kind of assessing two things. So the first one is quality. And this is the area where we would definitely say that altmetrics have not really progressed that much, or they're not that advanced. I think you all agree, sort of the gold standard for measuring quality is peer review or simply picking up an article and reading it. And that's probably going to stay for quite some time. But there are things that altmetrics can do to sort of help augment this quality review. This is where we get into the altmetrics being supplemental versus in place of, just to clarify. But things like Faculty of 1,000 rankings, that gives you information. Things that are a bit more in-depth, like systematic reviews of the Cochrane Foundation, where they actually do a search of sort of all literature about a particular topic, and they look at every single study and decide not just was that study high quality, but was that actually contributing to defining best practices. So you can't get that information from traditional metrics. That's altmetrics, and that gives you some information about quality. The other big thing is impact. And this is where altmetrics really comes into its own. If you look at citations, you could say you can look at impact, but if you did, you were using a really sort of narrow definition of impact, because citations really are only going to show you impact in that sort of scholarly sphere. If you want to go beyond that, then you're looking at altmetrics. So with altmetric data sets, that's when you can start to see, are the right people seeing my information? Am I getting the right reach? Am I having that social or economic impact that I hoped? And even things like, am I impacting practice and policy? So with this, you're not using social media for that, but you are using altmetrics because we're able to look at those policy documents created by NGOs and funding bodies and see what they're referencing to define that. So that's just also a reminder, too, that altmetrics are not just social media. Having said that, now I'll talk about social media again. So what do we think of social media as being? I think most times people think of Twitter and Facebook, and maybe it ends there, and then they kind of think, that's not so useful to me. But actually, it's more than that. It's the blogs we just spoke about. It's things like peer review, PubPeer, and it's even websites with the sort of question and answer things like Math Overflow. All right, so let's come back to that question of, what if social media were actually considered to be sort of a first-class output? What would that have to look like? So there's three things that come to mind. One has to be permanent. So somebody has to say, I promise to keep this information online forever. It has to have an identifier, so we can always find it if it does happen to move within the web. And the last one is it has to have some sort of, I want to say, sort of standard of ethics. So they have a case like the Nassau paper that there's some means or mechanism of either taking that information down or at least giving some sort of amendment to say that this was faulty. And we can kind of see this happening, or this sort of progression to becoming an actual research output now, if you look at two things. One is data sets, and to a lesser extent, code. And with both those, we see examples like Figshare and GitHub. Those they're sort of becoming permanent, and they have an identifier. The third bit is still evolving. So let's take a look at, I just want to discuss two different types of social media and discuss if we think those actually could be considered research output, or if maybe they're falling short. So blogs. There's been a lot of sort of thinking and talking about how blogs fit into the ecosystem of research. And traditionally, they have been considered as sort of a means of disseminating information to the public. So providing information about research in a more accessible sort of medium, but also in a more accessible language. And while that is a sort of large portion of blogs, that's not the only thing. We also see a lot of sort of exchange between researchers, so sort of scholarly outputs in blogs, researchers sharing information, exchanging ideas. These are often sort of in the form of reviews, either a review of a journal, like we saw that Rosie did, or maybe just a literature review. And then less common would be this open research, so people sharing their research as they're doing it online. The other thing that makes blogs kind of interesting is the behavior around researchers with them. So there's been a decent amount of work that shows that researchers are actually far more comfortable talking about research on their own blog than they are commenting on a journal website. So you could see examples of, on a journal website, the article's there and there is a single comment. And that comment on the journal website is actually a link. And it takes you to this research blog where they've done a full-blown review of an article, and they maybe have 25 to 30 comments below that. And so this is generally seen to be the case because researchers feel more comfortable on their own blog. They feel like they have some control over how it's being presented, who's viewing it, and if they need to, they can take it down. The reason I think that's interesting is that there's potentially this sort of segment of scholarly output that is seen nowhere else except in blogs. So if we weren't capturing that in some way, then we don't actually see it. So that's kind of the pro of blogs. The downside of blogs is this, and that's that many bloggers tend to publish under a pseudonym. And that's kind of at odds with what you want to see when you're talking about sort of rigorous science or research. You want someone to put their real name and really be able to stand by what they've done. This is actually an odd example where the flip happened. They actually published in a journal under the pseudonym. So for me, it would sort of say that blogs, while they do provide a valuable piece of information, they still may be a little bit of ways of being considered actual scholarly output to the degree that we think of an article. So that brings us to The Conversation. If you're not familiar with The Conversations, it's actually a nonprofit group out of Australia, and they now have, they're active in the US and UK, but they publish something that's kind of in between a blog and a journal article. So what they do is they work with institutions and find researchers within those to write sort of almost news articles about research topics. Now, they're not writing about their own research, they're writing about a research topic they know a lot about and are interested in. And the rationale here is that if you kind of rely on mainstream media, often science and research is reported in a pretty, I think, sensationalized way at best. In the worst case, they may be actually completely misrepresenting the research. So instead, with A Conversation, we have researchers talking about something that they find important, and they're giving us information about what they think is actually valuable and where that research is going. So just going back to those 3 points we talked about, sort of the permanence, the identifier, and the sort of the quality of work. With The Conversation, we can see that there is a degree of permanence. The Conversation themselves has said, yes, I'm going to take care of this piece of work. Maybe it's not as permanent as a journal, but definitely more so than sort of a blog post. We'll skip the second for a minute. On the third one, that sort of level of scientific rigor and sort of ethical code. In this case, the individual has their name posted, there's no pseudonyms, but they're also always affiliated with a university. And the university is really responsible or plays a part in deciding that this is sort of high quality research. What this doesn't have still would be the identifier. So there's no DOI, this is not being indexed in Scopus or tracked by Web of Science. So we have this case with A Conversation, somewhere between a blog and a journal article, kind of has 2 of the 3 things. So maybe we could see a future where this could, in maybe the near term, be considered an output. I don't know. But that kind of brings us full circle now. So if we were to say that some sort of social media, so maybe not blogs, but perhaps something in The Conversation, did become a viable sort of first-class alternative product, how would we measure that? Could we use citations and impact factor? Probably not. So I think we do see a scenario potentially in the future where we have both alternative products also being measured by the alternative metrics. So that's sort of my early prediction. We'll see if in 5 years you're talking about me like I just talked about NASA, but that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.